Hello everyone, I'm here Muhammad Asamutar will explain to you about deductive and inductive in psycholinguistics. And today we have a quote to build our spirit in learning psycholinguistics from Noam Chomsky, the great linguist we have ever known. The quote is, we shouldn't be looking for heroes, we should be looking for good ideas. So let's get started. Philosophy. Young's 2016 tolerance principle describes with incredible precision. Let's about to think. How many exceptions the mechanism of child language acquisition can tolerate to induce a productive learn, and as I pointed out in the previous post, it is a notable advance in the long-standing controversy that the amount of data necessary for the acquisition of language. This post, which is an abbreviated reworking of a recent paper, addressed a different but related issue, that of amount of data language variation needed by a linguist to develop a theory of language. So my point is that the two main types of current linguistics theory, roughly functionalism and formalism, correlate to different scientist methods, the inductive and the deductive one, respectively, and therefore the two types of theory have a different tolerance threshold regarding the spareness of data. But there is a paradox behind it. In fact, the relationship between data and theory in science is different depending on whether an inductive or a deductive methodology is employed. Following Daughtry 1976 characterization stated that we can say that in inductive model there is a certain set of procedures and operation with which the scientist uses the data to develop a theory. The theory is derived from the data by inductive processes. If the methodology is followed correctly, the scientist will arrive at an empirically modified theory to describe a phenomena under consideration. We can say that in inductive model there is a certain of procedures and operation with which the scientist uses the data to develop a theory. The theory is derived from the data by inductive processes, as I said in previous explanation just now. In this view, the discovery of a theory and the justification of a theory are a single process. Discovery and justification cannot be distinguished. On the contrary, the deductive model, there does not exist as a set of procedures and operation with which the scientist works on the data to discover a theory. Rather, in this model, the theory is a product of human creativity. A theory is a conjecture events as a possible explanation to the phenomena under investigation. According to Daughtry, the means by which a theory arrived are irrelevant in determining its empirical efficacy. The theory derives its total empirical motivation from the comparison of the consequences deduced from the theory with observable experimental phenomena. In this view, the discovery of a theory and the justification of theory are two different processes. The history of modern science is a clear illustration of a primacy in the realm of the natural sciences of the deductive method, generally known as the hypothetical deductive model. Chomsky's naturalistic conception of language implies the adoption of the hypothetical deductive method for linguistic theory. Chomsky pointed out specific languages reflect historical facts. For example, a Norman sequence or a Pesquet substantum that cannot be recorded as properties of a foreign language. And for this reason, the inductive model is simply insufficient to discover the truth about foreign language. As Chomsky pointed out, languages constitute as a natural phenomenon, and languages are understood as particular environmentally conditioned and historically modified manifestations of the phenomenon. That is, we proceed deductively from language to languages. One of the clearest examples of this procedure is parametric theory. Parametric theory states that from common design principles, the various emerging systems respond to variation in development processes that have systematic implications, just as happens in the development of natural organisms. In contrast, from a functionalist point of view, we proceed inductively from languages to language. This model implies that languages exist in themselves and that languages' secondary concepts induced from the descriptive generalization obtained from the study of languages. Authors in the broad area of functionalisms and also so-called cognitive linguistics favor an inductive model of linguistic theory for one clear reason. They do not consider foreign language to be a legitimate object of study. In general, such authors conceive of languages as cultural objects or institutions that are not the instantaneous of a biologically determined faculty of language, but are objects that must be studied in themselves and for themselves. In view of these two models of linguistic theory, it is easier to understand why there has been a controversy in our discipline regarding the question of how many languages do we need to formulate a theory of the faculty of language. In strictly logical terms, this question has only two answers. The first one is a sufficient number of languages, or the second one is all languages. What I mean here, the possible answer is no one is not acceptable, since we would no longer be in the field of empirical sciences. And again, in strictly logical terms, the deductive model will have to choose first as a response, and the inductive model should choose second theory and second answer, what I mean. However, it is clear that the answer number 2 is ineffective, since studying all languages is not possible. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of languages have been extinguished without a trace, and many of those that remain are undocumented. Therefore, the truly relevant question is what it means by a sufficient number for each of the models, given the impossibility of option number 2. The inductive approach has developed protocols to determine representative samples, such as in the case of typological studies, usually in the direction of maximizing both genealogical and oral diversity. But we should not ignore the fact that any selection will be arbitrary and incomplete, and therefore potentially descriptive to the inductive model. Something that we have to note here in this discussion, that all the Chomsky admins that that will be necessary to investigate other languages in comparable detail to confirm or to falsify hypotheses. But in fact, and again speaking theoretically, this would not be necessary if we were able to distinguish in the study of a specific language those of its elements which derive from the environmental and those which emerge from the organism itself, and which are therefore a predictionist for the acquisition. But of course, we have no way of doing this directly, and hence, for such an objective, the consideration of language diversity is essential as a means of refining the theory. Verifying the formal properties in which languages or dialects differ has a very directly bearing on what aspects of language are not fixed by nature. There's one more important point to note here that we are now discussing about deductive and inductive in psycholinguistics, whereas it is clear that the consideration of language diversity is crucial for the development of a theory of foreign language. This does not imply that we should accept as functionalist, for example, like the Comrie has been stated in 1981, that the theory of language must be inductive. For Comrie, the idea that the study of language can serve to discover universal properties of language is unacceptable, and in defense, Greenberg's option that in order to establish something as universally in language, it will be necessary to consider a wide variety of languages. Comrie also recognizes that the coherence of Chomsky's position and makes a useful comparison with other sciences. And now, finally, arrive in a conclusion. An inductive theory is essentially determined by the data from which it is obtained. The more detailed the description of linguistic variation, the more complex the theory becomes. And a deductive theory, rather, is by definition less dependent on the data, although obviously it must have empirical support. As a consequence, inductive models tend to emphasize diversity to the determination of language uniformity, whereas deductive models such as generative grammar tend to consider linguistic diversity as superficial and largely confined to the components of language externalization.